Namaste. I'm Reverend Wendy Craig-Purcell here at the Unity Center in beautiful San Diego. Thank you so much for subscribing to this channel. Please make sure that you like the video you've just watched and consider making a contribution on our app or on our website. It's really easy to do, and thank you in advance for that support. It does make a difference. So this idea of being enough, I think, really is at the heart also of the virtue of temperance. You know, it really is an old-fashioned sounding word. You know, we've been studying the virtues. We studied the virtue of prudence, the virtue of fortitude, and today the virtue of temperance. And these words sound just super, super old-fashioned. And yet, at the heart of them is absolute wisdom and truth. Absolute wisdom and truth. And this idea of temperance really is the idea of moderation, the idea of enough. But it's so easy to think of it in terms of, well, it's self-denial, it's deprivation. And it really isn't that. It really isn't that. It's about finding that middle path, about finding that experience of balance. And it is about a voluntary practice or a voluntary restraint, a voluntary moving into this idea of enough. When is it enough? And to look at that across all the areas of our life and practice. Not just with the obvious things when we think of temperance, and especially in the old-fashioned way, we might think of temperance as it relates to drinking, or as it relates to smoking, or as it relates to sex, or as it relates to food, all of these kinds of places. And yes, it can include all of that, but it goes broader and deeper than that. The ancients regarded temperance as a necessary balance between extremes. How many of you remember the experience of learning to ride a two-wheel bicycle? Raise your hand. Probably most of us in this room. I don't know if it was true for everyone, but I know that when I was growing up, learning how to ride a two-wheel bicycle, that it began with a very helpful tool. And that helpful tool was the tool of training wheels. Anybody have training wheels on their two-wheel bicycle? Was I the only one? No, okay, about half of you that had your hands up. I don't know how you learned, but I learned with the training wheels. And at first, those training wheels were both on the ground next to the back tire. So it was like one tire in front, one tire in back, and those two little tiny tires, the training wheels. And then my dad would lift them up, the training wheels, up, 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 so that I had to balance more and more and find that place of enough, if you will, that perfect place of balance, that place in between the extremes. The longer I've been in the study and the attempted practice of spiritual principle, the more I've come to appreciate the importance of this idea of the balance or the middle ground. It's very much at the core of Buddhist teaching and practice, the middle way, the way of balance. Cicero said, temperance is the moderating of one's desires in obedience to reason. The moderating of one's desires in obedience to reason. Self-confession here. In fact, I even put it in my notes when I was writing this lesson, and I prepare these well in advance. And as I was writing the lesson, I have this funny thing when I write a talk. I'm somewhat distracted. I write for a while, and then I get up, and the staff knows I'm wandering the building. And it's usually on a Tuesday, and they know if she's wandering, ignore her. She's trying to think through stuff. And then I sat back down, and I'm working on it some more. And then I'm up again, and I'm grabbing for tortilla chips. Despite the fact that I had worked so hard to drop a few of the extra pounds I put on during the toughest part of the pandemic, instead of grabbing a piece of fruit or another jug of water, I grabbed tortilla chip, and I'm putting the tortilla chip in my mouth as I'm working on this lesson on temperance, working on this lesson on moderation. And I found myself saying, wow, even when we know these things, sometimes we just fall asleep and forget to practice them. To know and not to do is not to know. It's getting better and better and better at closing the gap between what we know and what we're able to consistently practice. And when we catch ourselves falling off balance, not beating ourselves up for falling off balance, but to notice and say, oh, I'm a little out of balance here. Let me bring myself back to center. It's about moderating. It's about when is enough enough? And yet, if you think about it, we don't get a whole lot of messaging in the world around us, do we, for the value of this? Instead, we get pretty consistent messaging to exactly the opposite, to buy more, to do more, to get more, to use more and more and more and more. I remember a number of years ago, my sister-in-law, Carol, was out visiting, and we took our daughter Jennifer, out clothing shopping. And I think we were in Marshall's or something like that, but just picking out some things for her. And Aunt Carol and I had a lot of stuff in the cart for Jennifer, with Jennifer's of things she liked. And then we walked into the dressing room. And if I remember correctly, they had like 3 different hooks in there. Gotta have, definitely, maybe, and no. Very much on the side of all the things that you want. And as Jennifer's kind of trying things on, she was a little emotional. And I said, what's the matter? And she said, I don't need all this stuff. I don't need all this stuff. And I thought, whoa, of all people, both John and I worked very hard to practice moderation in our own lives and really to do our best to raise conscious kids that would at least live within the question, is this enough? Is it a need or is it a want, right? And it was such a revealing moment of, wow, it's so easy to fall into that. And here she was saying, I don't need all of it. I don't need all of it. It's this inner wisdom that comes, but it doesn't come unless we're first introduced to the idea of the value of enough, or the value of moderation, or the value of balance. When we're introduced to the idea of it and it makes sense to us, then it's a matter of catching ourselves when we're living within that practice and being grateful that we're making some progress, and catching ourselves when we're out of balance, when we're leaning too far from one side or too far to the other side, and noticing that and making whatever slight adjustment we can. So temperance, or moderation if you prefer that word, or enoughness if you prefer that, is about life in balance, not self-denial. About life in balance, not self-denial. A temperate life is not a reduced life, really, but an enhanced life. Let me read a piece to you that I came across from a Roger Peterson. He's an author of a number of books on birds. And this is a piece of his writing where he's talking about how he learned to live within limits by observing birds. Now stop and think about it for a moment. When I think about the image of birds, I don't think about limits as much as I think about free flight. Any of you think of like that's kind of the first response? But here's a person who writes about and studies birds, saying that it is in the process of an observation he had that he was helped to learn to live within limits. As a young person, he envied them, their freedom, while his whole life seemed regimented, very routine, very structured and organized. But as he studied them more closely, he learned that they too, despite appearances, learn to live within limits. They are bound, he writes, by all sorts of natural laws. They go north and south almost by the calendar. They follow certain flyways and routes between their summer and winter homes. A robin that lives in Connecticut this year is not going to think of going to Wisconsin next year. Their mating rituals are rituals. Disturb them and they will not reproduce. Many of them have a territory, and their sweet songs are not just songs of joy, but they're functional, a proclamation of ownership. Birds, then, are almost as earthbound as we are, he writes. Almost as earthbound as we are. They have freedom and mobility only within prescribed limits. Freedom and mobility only within prescribed limits. I find that to be very insightful. Very, very insightful. One of our members, non-geographical member, her name is Coral. She lives in Queensland, Australia, recently wrote me, and she listens to our lessons and shares some of them with her group. She's part of a Buddhist meditation group, and she found us during the pandemic, and she will frequently write me. And she wrote just this past week, or maybe it was a little bit longer ago than that, about something that Michael Singer wrote about in his best-selling book, The Untethered Soul. And he was writing about the Tao being the middle way, and much of what I'm talking about this morning is moderation and temperance, is about us finding our middle way in life, in all different areas of our lives, whether it's health or finances or our busy lives, finding that middle way. And he writes a bit and talks a bit about the pendulum and the extremes of the pendulum and the amount of energy it takes to live within any extreme. All the great teachings reveal the way of the center, the way of balance. Constantly look to see if that's where you are living or if you are lost in the extremes. The extremes create their opposites. Stay with that for a moment and think about that. The extremes create their opposites. The wise avoid them. Find the balance in the center and you will live in harmony. Can you get a sense of that as not just your mind, but your soul listens in? I bet as your soul listens in, you get a sense of that middle way. And so as as we take these ideas in, we are meant to take them in not just to understand them intellectually, but I think we're meant to take them in an exploratory way where we wonder, well, what does that mean for me in my life? So as you think about what's going on in your family life, as you think about what's going on in your work life, if you're still working, if you think about what's going on in your life after work, in retirement, if you think about the health of your body, your finances, where is this landing on you? Is there anything coming up saying, here's a place where maybe I've gotten kind of out of whack. Here's a place where I've not found that middle place. I'm lost in the extremes. He also used an analogy, or he also talked about what a blind person does when they are trying to navigate and trying to walk. That they're using their cane, tapping to find the edges, not to find where to walk, but to find where not to walk. He said, if you cannot see your way, all you can do is feel for the edges. But if you feel the edge and don't go there, you will stay in the way. That's how you live in the Tao. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? And much like Shana said when she finished her beautiful song, she said, simple, but we were clapping so much I didn't hear exactly what she finished, but I think she was pointing to, yes, it's simple, and yes, it's true. And it takes practice to stay there, right? That's why we have to do it on repeat, again and again. Some broken records are good broken records. They really are. I remember growing up and my mom would often say of my brother and I, who would fight constantly, that we were a broken record. And in that regard, she had every right to say broken record. She wanted it stopped. But some broken records, some things should be stuck on repeat. Those affirmations that you are enough, to find your middle way, to bring your true, authentic self forward. You know the affirmations, you know the things you need to hold on to and to remember and to have be stuck on repeat. In nature, we see that living things learn well how to live within their limits. Nature does a very good job of that. And if something goes wonky and a species overextends itself, it begins to die back at its own peril. If it abuses the environment that it's in, if it takes more than it really needs, it begins to cause harm to itself. It's been said, and I don't remember the exact statistic or the exact figure here, but it's been said that the quickest way to bring the planet back to beautiful balance would be if we weren't here. And if that's true, and I kind of think it probably is, at least it has a big part of it, that's a sobering thought. But it's also an empowering thought. And it's an empowering thought because to the degree that we are willing to voluntarily ask ourselves, am I living in enough? And to honestly answer those questions, we will begin to find that balance for ourselves, and we will begin to be more of a beneficial presence in the world. So it's not denial, but it's constraint. It's not denial, but constraint. It's directing. It's giving shape and form. There was a minister who was also a professor in Scotland who lived between 1848 and 1927. And he wrote a piece about this idea. Some of the language is certainly outdated by the way that we talk today. But he wrote about this idea of the power of constraint, the blessing of constraint. He said, when fire breaks loose and rages on its own account, it carries swift destruction in its course. But when restricted within certain bounds, it warms our rooms and cooks our food and illuminates our towns and drives our locomotives. In the same way, water, when in flood, roots up trees, carries away houses, and sweeps the crops from the fields, but when confined within its banks, drives the wheel and floats the barge, and rejoices the eye either by its placid flow or by the splendors of eye. So the very qualities that when unregulated waste and brutalize life, may, when subjected to the control of temperance, be its fairest ornaments. Brings us back to balance. I want to close with this idea as well, that temperance, moderation, is something we, I think, want to look at across the board of how we live our lives. Mahatma Gandhi said, there's more to life than merely increasing its speed. I don't know how those words land on you, but part of the reason Shayna's song rests so deeply in my heart is I too see myself in that song with so many responsibilities, so much work needing to remind myself, today I am enough, but also reminding myself of the wisdom of Gandhi here, that there's more to life than merely increasing its speed. And I would add, in figuring out how to add one more thing into an already busy and full life. Our lives today, for many of us, do seem to be governed by speed and hurry and tension. I was driving home from the office from here this past week, and I had the news on, which I often do, and I was listening to part of an interview that confirms some of what I have been witnessing as I'm on the freeways during this time of the pandemic. And what I was hearing was about the excessive and aggressive driving. And you've heard me mention that. I just hadn't heard it on the news. And I was startled by this, and I was reflecting on Gandhi's point here, there's more to life than merely increasing its speed. What the CHP, the California Highway Patrol, has noticed is that since the pandemic, in particular between April of last year and September of this year, our CHP has issued 44,500 citations to people traveling on our freeways in excess of 100 miles an hour. That's how it hit me as well. 44,500 in excess of 100 miles an hour. And the reason for this reporting was there is a grant, I don't remember the amount of the grant, but to increase surveillance, to try to bring these speeds down to a safer place, because they were also tracking the number of fatalities as a result of this aggressiveness. So this is where some of what we talk about spiritually, our practices of balance and moderation and enough, have very real consequences, not just for ourselves, but for our loved ones as well. And so, circling back a bit to what I said in the very opening, that unity is really about a very practical approach to spirituality. It's about understanding some basic ideas, having some basic tools, and then using them in the nitty-gritty of our lives, whether we're talking about how we drive our cars or how we shop or how much stuff we put in a cart for a young girl. It's all of that and more. Close with this thought. Are you willing to ask deeply of yourself, are there places in my life where I am out of balance? Are there places in my life that I am in excess? And if so, am I willing to do something to begin to bring it back to a place of balance? I leave you with that question. Namaste.